They say the most expensive thing you can buy is a private jet or a glass skyscraper. But they're wrong. I'll tell you a secret. The most expensive thing in the world is the truth about the person sleeping right next to you. And usually, you only get the invoice for that truth when you're already standing in the wreckage of your own life. Welcome back to the channel. Before we get into today's story, make sure you're subscribed and have your notifications on. This is a masterclass in why you should never mistake a quiet man for a defeated one. Drop a "ready" in the comments if you've ever had a gut feeling that someone was only with you for the momentum, not the man. The thing about being a billionaire in the tech world is that everyone expects the hoodie and the arrogance. I prefer a different kind of armor. I call it digital invisibility. I wear unbranded gray t-shirts that cost $200 but look like they came from a 3-pack at a drugstore. I drive a nondescript electric SUV with no badges and a slightly dusty hood. To a stranger at a stoplight, I'm just another middle management guy wondering if he can afford his mortgage. My name is Sullivan Vance. For the last 15 years, I've sat at the center of a web of software and logistics that quietly powers the infrastructure of 3 major cities. My personal net worth is a number that would make your vision blur if you saw it on a screen. But for 6 months, I spent $2 million on a controlled demolition. I leaked the rumors, I froze the accounts, and I watched my public image go up in flames. I wanted to see who would stay in the room when the oxygen ran out. And that's when my wife, Elara, told me she needed a business trip to clear her head. She thought she was flying toward a fresh start with the country's most ruthless divorce lawyer. She didn't realize she was just entering the final stage of my stress test. That's exactly how I designed it. The world thinks it knows what a $4 billion collapse looks like. They expect the frantic 2 a.m. phone calls, the sirens of federal investigators, and the sight of a CEO being led out of a glass tower with a suit jacket draped over his handcuffs. But when I orchestrated the failure protocol, I didn't want a spectacle, I wanted a funeral. I wanted to see who would show up to mourn the man and who was just there to pick through the estate. It took 6 months of surgical precision to build the lie. I leaked internal memos to the right mid-level analysts, people I knew were hungry enough to sell a tip to the press. I manipulated my own algorithms to show a phantom bleed in our primary logistics architecture. By the time the Financial Times ran the headline, "Vance Global, the architect of an empty empire," I had already moved my real assets into a ghost network that didn't exist on any public server. The mourning period that followed was the most illuminating time of my life. Within 48 hours of the news breaking, the silence was deafening. My phone, which usually buzzed with 1,000 frantic demands for my time, became a cold piece of glass. My inner circle of Silicon Valley peers, men who had toasted my health on my yacht just a month prior, suddenly couldn't remember my assistant's name. Invitations to charity galas were rescinded with polite, automated emails. I was no longer a person, I was a contagion. I spent those first few days sitting in my study, watching the vultures circle through a monitor. I saw the secondary market for my company's stock get stripped to the bone by people I'd called friends. It was clinical. It was efficient. And it was exactly what I needed to see. But the real test wasn't happening in the markets. It was happening 10 feet away in the kitchen. Elara was the only one who didn't pull away immediately, but her touch had changed. It went from the warmth of a partner to the forced pity of a social worker. She started spending more time on her phone, her thumbs scrolling with a frantic energy she thought I couldn't see. She spoke about space and clarity. She stopped looking at my face and started looking at the house, measuring the rooms with her eyes as if she were already calculating their value in a liquidation sale. I sat there in my gray t-shirt, sipping lukewarm coffee, playing the part of the broken man. I let the silence grow between us until it felt like a physical wall. I wanted to give her every opportunity to prove me wrong, to be the one person who didn't care about the momentum. But as I watched her pack a small, expensive leather suitcase for her urgent business trip to the coast, I knew the protocol had worked. The mourning period was over. Now the audit was beginning. Watching Elara navigate the wreckage of our supposed life was like observing a high-stakes auction where the primary lot had just been revealed as a forgery. She didn't scream, and she didn't cry. Instead, she grew quiet, a heavy, tactical silence that I recognized from her days brokering deals for blue-chip art. To the world, she looked like a supportive wife absorbing a blow. To me, she looked like an investor calculating the quickest way to liquidate a failing asset. The shift was in the details. It was the way she stopped calling me Sully and started using my full name, as if she were distancing herself from the person and preparing to address a defendant. Her voice, usually warm and melodic, took on a brittle, professional edge. When she spoke about our future, she no longer used the word we. It was always the situation, or the house, or your obligations. She was already mentally partitioning our shared world into hers and mine. One evening, 3 days after the headlines broke, she sat across from me in the living room. The overhead lights were dimmed, casting long shadows that made the minimalist furniture look like cold monuments. She was nursing a glass of wine she'd poured from a bottle she thought I could no longer afford to replace. "Sullivan," she said, her eyes fixed on a point just past my shoulder. "I've been thinking about the collection. And the house. If the creditors move in, everything we've built is at risk." "I'm working on it, Elara," I lied, keeping my voice low and weary. "The lawyers say we might be able to shield a few things if we move fast." She nodded, but her mind was already elsewhere. "I need to go to the coast. There's a private acquisition meeting in Monterey, an estate piece I've been tracking for months. If I can close the commission on this, it gives us a liquid cushion. It gives me a way to help." It was a beautiful lie, delivered with the practiced poise of a woman who knew exactly how to weaponize a man's pride against him. She wasn't going to Monterey for a painting. She was going because she had realized that being the wife of a disgraced tech failure didn't fit her brand. She needed an exit, and she needed it to look like a necessity. I watched her pack the next morning. She moved with a surgical efficiency, choosing pieces that were versatile, expensive, and easy to carry. She didn't ask for my help, and she didn't offer a kiss goodbye. She just touched my arm, a fleeting, cold contact, and promised to call when she landed. As the taillights of her car disappeared down the driveway, I pulled up my private server. I didn't need a phone call to know where she was going. The business trip was officially underway, and for the first time in 7 years, I was finally seeing my wife in high resolution. The drive to the coast wasn't a pursuit, it was an audit. I didn't need to tailgate her or hire a private investigator with a grainy camera. In the world I built, everyone leaves a digital shadow, and Elara's was glowing. I tracked the MAC address of her car, the silent pings of her encrypted messaging apps, and the sudden, sharp activation of a premium concierge service she thought was shielded by a corporate firewall. She was heading to a cliffside estate in Big Sur, a place known more for its non-disclosure agreements than its architecture. I followed her at a distance of 20 miles, driving a rented, mid-sized sedan that smelled of cheap upholstery and industrial cleaner. It was the perfect camouflage for a man supposedly stripped of his pride. While she moved toward what she thought was a clean break, I moved through the ghost path, a secondary network of satellite nodes I'd launched 3 years ago to ensure my own data could never be subpoenaed or tracked by competitors. From my dashboard, I could see her heart rate via her smartwatch, spiked with a mixture of adrenaline and what I hoped was a lingering, vestigial guilt. The estate, a brutalist masterpiece of glass and concrete perched over the Pacific, came into view just as the sun began to dip into the water. It was owned by a holding company that specialized in high-conflict transitions. To Elara, this was a fortress where she could negotiate the terms of her new life without the interference of a bankrupt husband. To me, it was just another node on my map. I parked a quarter-mile down the coast road and walked the rest of the way. The air was cold, tasting of salt and expensive pine mulch. As I reached the perimeter, my phone vibrated. She had checked in. But she wasn't alone. The digital signature of another device appeared on my screen, a high-end, heavily encrypted tablet belonging to a legal firm that didn't take cases unless the retainers started with 6 zeros. I stood in the shadows of the cypress trees, watching the warm glow of the villa's floor-to-ceiling windows. I saw her silhouette move across the living room, elegant even in her betrayal. She looked lighter, her shoulders finally free of the weight of my failure. She had no idea that the very ground she was standing on was part of a portfolio I'd quietly acquired through a blind trust back in 2022. She thought she had found a sanctuary away from my reach, but she had actually just walked into the center of my lab. I adjusted the collar of my jacket and started toward the entrance. It was time to stop watching the data and start the confrontation. Inside the villa, the air was filtered and pressurized, smelling faintly of ozone and expensive leather. I moved through the shadows of the gallery, my footsteps swallowed by the silkweave rugs, until I reached the cracked open door of the library. That was where I saw him. Thorne Halcyon sat behind a slab of black marble, his presence so still and clinical he looked like part of the furniture. He didn't have the bluster of a typical high-stakes litigator. He had the terrifying, quiet focus of a surgeon preparing for a delicate, albeit messy, amputation. Thorne didn't look up as Elara paced the room. He was focused on a thick stack of documents, the autopsy report of my public life. The Vance global liquidation is moving faster than anticipated, Elara, he said, his voice a low, rhythmic drone that lacked any trace of empathy. The panic in the tech sector has lowered the valuation of his remaining personal equity. That is good for us. It makes him desperate. It makes him pliable. I just want it finished, Thorne, Elara said, her voice trembling slightly, though not with grief. It was the tremor of a predator worried the prey might have one last kick left in it. I can't stay in that house anymore. I can't be the face of a collapse. Thorne finally looked up, his pale eyes reflecting the glow of a tablet. Sentiment is a luxury we aren't billing for. Right now, Sullivan Vance is a corporate corpse. My job is to ensure you walk away with the lion's share of the marrow before the other creditors realize there's anything left to pick. He tapped a pen against the marble. We'll claim irreconcilable fraudulent behavior regarding the hidden losses. We'll paint him as a man who gambled your marital stability on a tech-ego trip. By the time I'm done with the deposition, he'll be grateful if we leave him with the Toyota. I watched from the darkness, leaning against the cold glass of the corridor. It was fascinating to hear your life discussed in the past tense by a man who didn't even know I was breathing the same air. Thorne was good. He was treating my fortune like a math problem he had already solved. He spoke about my corpse with a professional distance that made Elara nod in agreement, her betrayal now fully codified into a legal strategy. They were so focused on the carcass they thought I'd left behind that they didn't notice the heartbeat in the room. Thorne was a shark who lived for the scent of blood in the water, but he hadn't realized that the water was an aquarium, and I was the one holding the glass. I let him finish his sentence, a cold smile tugging at the corner of my mouth. It was time to show the shark what happens when the ocean decides to fight back. The silence of the hallway was a vacuum, broken only by the low, mechanical hum of the villa's climate control and the steady, cold rhythmic flow of Elara's voice. I leaned against the shadow of a marble pillar, my phone glowing with a dark interface that mirrored the audio being picked up by the high-gain microphones I'd hidden in her jewelry weeks ago. I wasn't just hearing her, I was witnessing the precise moment a 7-year marriage was filed down into a transaction. You have to understand, Thorne, Elara said, her tone devoid of the soft, melodic warmth she used when she wanted me to buy her a new gallery space. Sullivan was never the destination. He was the vehicle. When we met, he was this force of nature, a man who looked like he was going to redefine the entire vertical. I didn't fall for a person, I fell for a trajectory. I watched her through the gap in the door. She was tracing the rim of her wine glass with a manicured nail, her expression one of focused, professional detachment. It was the same look she gave when evaluating a piece of art, checking for cracks in the canvas, judging if the provenance would hold up under scrutiny. And now? Thorne asked. His voice was like a scalpel, peeling back the layers of her psyche to ensure there were no lingering sentimental attachments that could mess up a deposition. Now the trajectory has hit the ground, she replied, her voice dropping to a whisper that echoed through my earpiece with terrifying clarity. The momentum is gone. Watching him sit in that study, wearing those pathetic, unbranded shirts, acting like he's just simplifying his life while the world laughs at his bankruptcy, it's embarrassing. I spent a decade building a social standing that requires a billionaire's shadow to survive. If he's just a man with a dusty SUV and a failed startup, then I'm just a woman who wasted her prime on a bad bet. She took a slow, deliberate sip of wine. I never loved the man who watered the plants, Thorne. I loved the man who owned the sky. If the sky is falling, I'm not staying around to be crushed by the debris. Standing in the dark, I felt a strange, cold sense of relief. It was the feeling a developer gets when a bug is finally isolated, the aha moment when the system's failure finally makes perfect sense. She hadn't been a partner. She had been a passenger who was only interested in the speed, never the driver. I closed the app on my phone and felt the weight of my real net worth, the billions she thought were gone, settle into my bones like armor. The test was over. The diagnostic was complete. I wasn't a corporate corpse, and I wasn't a bad bet. I was the house, and the house was about to close the table. The transition from the digital ghost path to the physical world felt like crossing a high-voltage line. I smoothed the front of my unbranded, faded gray t-shirt, the one Elara had recently started calling depressing, and adjusted the cuffs of my worn denim jacket. I looked exactly like the man they had been dissecting, a tech founder whose ego had finally outpaced his bank account. I pushed the heavy oak doors of the library open without knocking, the sudden movement cutting through the clinical silence of their strategy session like a physical blow. Elara gasped, her wine glass rattling against the marble table as she bolted upright. Thorne Halcyon didn't move a muscle, but his eyes narrowed, shifting from the documents to me with the cold, predatory curiosity of a shark encountering a new type of debris. Sullivan? Elara's voice was a frantic mix of shock and irritation. What are you doing here? I told you this was a private business trip. How did you even find this place? I didn't answer her immediately. I let my gaze wander around the room, taking in the expensive brutalism of the estate, the smell of the sea air, and the thick stack of legal papers sitting between them. I made sure to look slightly breathless, a man who had spent his last few dollars on a bus ticket and a prayer. The car had a tracker, Elara. I never turned it off, I said, my voice intentionally thin and desperate. I walked toward the table, my sneakers squeaking on the polished floor. I came because I thought you were in trouble. I thought you were trying to sell your personal collection to help me save the firm. But I see I've interrupted a different kind of acquisition. I looked at Thorne, who was watching me with an expression of pure, professional disdain. And you must be the help, I said, projecting a hollow bravado. Mr. Vance, Thorne said, his voice as dry as parchment. I am Thorne Halcyon. Your wife has retained my services to ensure a clean transition of assets during your current fiscal instability. You shouldn't be here. This is a private consultation. Sullivan, please. Elara stepped toward me, her face a mask of practiced pity. You're making this harder. The business is gone. The house is going. Thorne is just helping me protect what's left of my life before the banks take everything you touched. You need to leave. You're not thinking clearly. I slumped into one of the velvet chairs, burying my face in my hands for a moment to hide the cold, calculating clarity in my eyes. I played the part of the broken husband, the man who had lost his sky and was finally realizing the earth was just as cold. I let a heavy silence hang in the room, long enough to see Elara glance at Thorne with a look that said, "See? He's pathetic." I just wanted to know if any of it was real, I whispered into my palms. The 7 years. The support. Was I just a vehicle to you, Elara? She didn't answer. She just looked at Thorne, signaling him to finish the job. They thought they were watching a man hit rock bottom. They had no idea I was just checking the temperature of the water before I pulled the plug on their entire world. Thorne Halcyon didn't offer a chair, and he didn't offer a glass of water. He simply adjusted the French cuffs of his shirt and looked at me with the weary patience of a man explaining arithmetic to a child. The documents on the marble table were fanned out like a winning hand in a game I was supposed to have already lost. Mr. Vance, let's dispense with the theatrics, Thorne said, his voice dropping into a register of practiced, clinical intimidation. We've audited the public filings of Vance Global. We've seen the credit freezes and the panicked sell-offs. In 48 hours, the bankruptcy court is going to lock your doors. Right now, you are a liability to Elara's reputation and her future. If you sign these papers tonight, we will agree not to pursue a discovery into your offshore personal holdings, which I'm sure are as depleted as your company's accounts. Elara stood by the window, her back to me, watching the dark Pacific waves crash against the rocks. She didn't look back as Thorne continued. We're asking for the Big Sur property, the art advisory firm, and a structured payout over 5 years. In exchange, Elara won't testify regarding the reckless mismanagement of marital funds. It's a gift, Sullivan. Take it, before the sharks in the city realize there's still meat on your bones. I let him finish. I even let a small, shaky sigh escape my lips to keep the mask from slipping too early. I looked at the pen he slid across the marble, a heavy, gold-plated instrument that cost more than the truck I'd driven to get here. You've been very thorough, Thorne, I said, my voice gaining a sudden, sharp clarity that made Elara turn around. You've analyzed the corpse perfectly. But there's a fundamental rule in tech that you seem to have missed. Never trust the data on a public server when the architect is still in the room. I reached into my jacket and pulled out a single, unbranded tablet. I tapped the screen once, and a live feed of Thorne's own firm's internal ledger flickered into view. Thorne's expression didn't break, but his pupils drifted toward the screen. I didn't come here to sign your settlement, I said, sliding my tablet toward him. I came to show you yours. While you were busy measuring my failures, I spent the afternoon acquiring the debt holding company that finances your partnership's private equity. As of 4 o'clock today, Thorne, I don't just own the firm you work for, I own the mortgage on this villa. And since Elara was so kind as to suggest we partition our assets, I think it's time we discuss the new terms of your employment. The silence that followed was absolute. Elara's glass finally slipped from her hand, shattering on the stone floor, but neither Thorne nor I looked at the mess. The shark had finally realized the water was freezing over. Thorne's hand stayed frozen over the gold-plated pen, his professional mask finally cracking to reveal a hollow, panicked void. He looked at the tablet as if it were a thermal detonator. On the screen, the scrolling lines of code and the red-stamped, acquired, status over his partnership's liability portfolio were undeniable. The silence in the room changed. It was no longer the silence of a clinical consultation, but the silence of a vault being locked from the outside. You're lying, Elara whispered, though her voice lacked any conviction. She stepped away from the window, her eyes darting between the broken glass on the floor and the tablet. The news, the headlines, you lost everything, Sullivan. I saw the freeze orders. You saw exactly what I wanted you to see, Elara, I said, my voice dropping into a low, terrifyingly calm register. In tech, we call it a sandbox environment. I built a playground of failure and invited the world to watch me burn. The bankruptcy was a series of shell companies I collapsed onto themselves, a digital sleight of hand that cost me less than the commission on that painting you were supposedly chasing. I didn't lose $4 billion, I moved it. I looked at Thorne, whose face had gone a sickly shade of gray. And as for you, Thorne, you specialize in corpses, right? You should have checked the pulse of the man who was funding your firm's expansion. This morning at 9:14 a.m., a subsidiary of my ghost network purchased the distressed debt of Halcyon and Associates. I didn't just track Elara to this house. I bought the house, the firm representing her, and the very air you're breathing in this room. Thorne finally found his voice, though it was thin and brittle. This is highly irregular. It's a conflict of interest. A judge will look at the signed retainer Elara gave you and see that you were conspiring to defraud a man you believe to be insolvent, I interrupted, leaning forward so the light from the tablet hit the sharp lines of my face. I didn't come here to argue law. I came to provide a hardware update. The old system, the one where you both thought you could carve me up for parts, is offline. I've wiped the drive. I stood up, the broke denim jacket feeling like a king's robe. Elara reached out as if to touch my arm, but she stopped, her hand hovering in the cold air. She was looking at me now with the same hunger she'd had on our wedding day, but this time, it was mixed with a visceral, jagged fear. She realized the man she had called pathetic 5 minutes ago was the only thing standing between her and a very cold, very public ruin. The audit is almost finished, I said, sliding the tablet into my pocket. I think it's time we talk about the final liquidation. The realization didn't hit Elara all at once. It arrived in waves of cold, mathematical certainty. She looked at me, then at the tablet, and finally at the shattered remnants of her wine glass. The momentum she had worshipped, the high-speed vehicle she thought had crashed, was suddenly humming with a power she could no longer access. She had jumped from a moving car because she thought the engine had failed, only to watch it accelerate into the distance without her. "Sullivan," she started, her voice sounding thin, like a recording played from a great distance. She took a step toward me, her hand reaching out in that familiar, magnetic way she used when she wanted to soften a blow. "You have to understand how it looked. The news, the debt collectors. I was scared. I was trying to protect our future in the only way I knew how." "No, Elara," I said, my voice as flat as a digital readout. "You were protecting your future. You were protecting the art advisory, the social calendar, and the image of the woman who married a titan. You weren't scared for us. You were scared of being ordinary." I pulled a single sheet of paper from my jacket, the only physical document I'd brought. It wasn't a settlement, and it wasn't a plea. It was a pre-signed exit, a document her own assistant had helped me prepare weeks ago under the guise of an NDA. "I didn't come here to save the marriage," I continued, watching her eyes track the paper. "The marriage died the moment you called my life embarrassing to a man you just met. I came here to finalize the liquidation. Since you've already informed Thorne that I'm a corporate corpse, I've decided to agree with you. To the world and to you, Sullivan Vance is dead. But the man who owns this villa and the firm representing you is very much alive. And he doesn't have a wife." Elara looked at Thorne, but the shark was gone. He was staring at the floor, likely wondering if his own partnership agreement had a morality clause he could use to save his career. He wouldn't help her. No one would. She had traded a billionaire's loyalty for a lawyer's ambition, and now she was standing in the middle of a high-priced estate she no longer had the right to inhabit. "Where am I supposed to go?" she whispered. "To the life you thought I had," I replied. I turned toward the door, the weight of the 7-year life finally lifting. The SUV is out front. It's a 2018 model, the battery is at 40%, and the lease is up on Friday. It's exactly the kind of middle-class reality you were so afraid of. Enjoy the drive. I walked out of the library without looking back. Behind me, I heard the sound of a chair scraping against the marble, the sound of a woman finally realizing that the person who owns the sky doesn't need a passenger who's afraid of heights. The drive back to the city was the quietest hour of my life. The digital noise had finally settled into a flat, peaceful line. There were no more pings from encrypted servers, no more intercepted whispers from a wife who saw me as a transaction, and no more predatory strategies from a lawyer who thought he could outmath the architect. I drove my unbranded SUV through the midnight fog of the coast, feeling the hum of the engine, a machine that, like me, didn't need a badge to prove its power. I reached my private office at 3 a.m. The building was a monolith of shadow, its glass skin reflecting the empty streets of a city that still believed I was a bankrupt ghost. I didn't turn on the overhead lights. I sat in my ergonomic chair, the only light in the room coming from the triple monitor array that flickered to life at my touch. The first task was the data cleanup. I opened the directory labeled Events, a folder that contained 7 years of digital history, from our first vacation photos in Amalfi to the high-resolution logs of her betrayal in Big Sur. I hovered the cursor over the delete icon. For a split second, I remembered the way she looked in the sunlight of our wedding day, before the momentum became her only god. Then, I remembered her voice in that villa, calling my life embarrassing. I clicked. The progress bar moved with a surgical, silent efficiency, deleting 4.2 terabytes. When the screen cleared, I felt a strange, pressurized sense of security. I was more alone than I had been in a decade, but for a man like me, isolation is just another word for an airtight system. There were no more vulnerabilities in the perimeter. No more passengers who would sabotage the vehicle at the first sign of a stall. I opened a fresh, encrypted workspace. I didn't look at the stock market or the news headlines that were still mourning my collapse. Instead, I began to type the first lines of a new architecture. A system designed to be truly invisible, one that wouldn't just power cities, but would monitor the very concept of loyalty before it ever had a chance to fail. I took a sip of cold coffee and looked out at the horizon, where the first hint of gray was touching the skyline. Elara was out there somewhere, likely realizing that the broke husband she left was the only thing that had ever made her life feel like a masterpiece. But I wasn't looking for her. I was looking at the code. The world thinks it knows what I am, and that is my greatest asset. I am the man who failed, the billionaire who lost it all, the husband who wasn't enough. It's a perfect disguise. I leaned back, my silhouette lost in the darkness of the office, and started the next build. This time, I wasn't building to be seen. I was building to be certain. And in this version of the world, the house always wins. Take a seat. I'm glad you're still here. Looking at me now, in this same gray t-shirt, you probably see the man who lost a $4 billion empire. You probably think you're watching a tragedy. But that's the first lesson I need you to understand. Never mistake a controlled burn for a house fire. In the tech world, we stress test everything. We push the hardware until it snaps just to see where the fracture begins. Why should a marriage, a friendship, or a business partnership be any different? Most people spend their lives building on sand, terrified that the tide will come in. I decided to bring the tide in myself. And what did I find? I found that loyalty isn't something you can buy, but it is something you can audit. Elara didn't leave because I was bankrupt. She left because she couldn't handle the lack of a spotlight. She was a passenger who loved the speed, but hated the driver. If you're building something, whether it's a company or a life, you have to know who is in the car with you when the engine stalls. Because if they're looking for the exit the moment the momentum dips, they were never really there to begin with. That's what we do here. We pull back the curtain on the perfect lives, the loyal families, and the honest partners to show you the cold, hard data underneath. We show you that being invisible is the ultimate power, and that the best way to win is to let your enemies think they've already defeated you. If you want to learn how to move through the world 3 steps ahead of everyone else, if you want to know how to spot the vultures before they start circling, then you're in the right place. Go ahead and hit that subscribe button. Drop a comment below and tell me, have you ever felt like a passenger in your own life? Or are you ready to start the audit? Stick around. The next build is always more secure than the last. And as Elara found out the hard way, in this version of the world, the house always wins.